No, wherever you want to. So it's 6 o'clock and welcome everybody to the third workshop for the general plan update. We had to go to primarily remote Zoom options. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We've got over 30, probably about 40 participants with us right now on Zoom and a few here in the house. This is an important milestone as we will be discussing the alternatives report or choosing a direction of where the Solvang really wants to go and focusing on land use and circulation today. But this is not the last opportunity for everybody to comment. A survey on this subject will be available for almost a month after this workshop. So we'll continue to receive feedback. And we'll also be bringing this afterwards to the City Council and the Planning Commission. And we'll be going through the process of developing each element of the general plan, where there will be plenty of opportunities for community to continue to comment on each one of those. So welcome everybody today. Thank you for all your input you're about to provide. And with that, I will turn it over to our consultants for the general plan, Mintier Harnish, to introduce their team.
Perfect. Thank you, Xenia, and thank you, everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces here on the Zoom screen. As many of you, I have participated in the previous two workshops, the community study session we held back in February of last year, and then community workshop number 2 on existing conditions back in April of 2021. My name is Brent Gibbons. I am the project manager on the consultant team. I work for Mintier Harnish. We're a planning consulting firm out of Sacramento, and we're the lead consultant here working with the city of Solvang on their general plan update and subsequently your housing element update. With me here tonight is Jim Harnish. He's the principal and owner of Mintier Harnish. We have Michael Gibbons, who is an associate planner, and we have Jordan Cowell here, who is the assistant project manager for our team. Xenia had mentioned that this is a crucial evening when we talk about land use alternatives and future growth. So we wanted to make sure that we included other teaming partners that are a part of this effort. So with Applied Development Economics, we have Doug Svensson here. Doug Svensson is focusing on the fiscal impacts of the general plan update and the alternatives. We have Jim Damkowicz with DKS. They focus on traffic and mobility and circulation issues. So any questions on that and that portion of the presentation, Jim will give. And then lastly, we have Della Acosta with Rincon Consultants. Rincon focuses on the environmental aspects of the general plan, and they'll be leading the environmental impact report as part of the CEQA process towards the end of this project, as well as supplementing with some of the general plan policies and goals moving forward. So I'm going to share my screen and get this presentation going. Everyone can see this. Looks like we got some nods. Perfect. So the purpose of the workshop tonight is, first, I'm just going to provide a general overview of the general plan update, where we are. It's been a while since we've seen each other back in the spring, so I just want to provide a snapshot of where we are in the process, what to expect next through this timeline. Then we'll take a dive into an overview of the alternatives report. We'll review the alternatives process, touch on the evaluation, so the comparison of the alternatives and what they mean and what the implications are, and touch on mobility options, and then anything related to traffic, mobility, and circulation. Then we'll round it out with a brief overview of a tourism and retail market analysis prepared by ADE. You will notice, if you've had a chance to look at the alternatives report online, that component is an appendix to the report. So we can get into that and how that was factored into the overall alternatives, and then what that means for the update moving forward. At the end of this evening, we'll open it up to public comment and a Q&A, and then Jordan, as part of our team, will lay out the next steps in the engagement process as part of this effort tonight. So the general plan update process, this slide should look very familiar. I think we've shown it at the last few meetings if you have attended. This process is in 6 different phases, all the way from project initiation back in December of 2020. And then we're gearing up toward adoption probably early 23, and we'll start looking toward that at the end of this year, end of 22. We've gone through phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 2 focused on existing conditions, which we brought to the community with the existing conditions workbook That was back in April. And we're in phase 3 right now, called alternatives. From phase 3, we move into the preparation of the actual general plan itself. That's the goals, the policies, and the programs, the checklist for that the community will look towards over the next 20 years. That will help guide future land use decisions, infrastructure decisions that your city council will make over the next 20 years. We round that out with phase 5, which is your environmental review. So that's a requirement of the California Environmental Quality Act. That's your EIR, Environmental Impact Report. And then what we all hope for in the end is to get to adoptions, where we can provide a document that is community-led and community-based, that meets the city's expectations for the next 20 years, looking out toward 2040. So tonight we are focused on phase 3, and we're looking at the land use alternatives. So the land use alternatives process, in a nutshell, the land use alternatives report is designed to look at bigger picture ideas. There's so many options that could come out of this. This is more of a 30,000 foot look at how potential change could occur and what the implications could be in Solvang. And it's important to point out that these are not necessarily proposals. These are just this is a comparative analysis of what could occur under certain conditions. And what's important to note here is that these comparative alternatives that were shown in the report, these will actually be brought forth to your city council and your planning commission. Well, they'll be able to weigh the pros and cons and the benefits of each of these alternatives, along with community feedback, in turn selecting what's known as a preferred alternative down the road that will help guide and facilitate the remainder of the general plan update. So this is really the first foundational piece moving forward to set up goals and expectations for Solvang over the next 20 years. So the alternative report, if you've had a chance to look at it online, it's on the Plan Solvang website. It's based on lots of different data sets. So lots of technical data goes into this in order to come up with these different comparative alternatives for the community. So on the screen here are just a few of the different technical data sets that we look at. We look at the assessor data from the county, and that's important because that tells us what's on the ground now, and then that we compare that to what your land use designations are when we start to look at different potential changes in land uses. We look at the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments. That gets into traffic modeling on a regional basis. So Solvang is part of the Santa Barbara County region. And so we look at their projections and their estimates moving forward, just as a comparison. US Census data and the American Community Survey, that is a census tool that provides benchmark population, demographics information, and we use that to start to provide the different comparisons. If there is growth, if there's not growth, what does that look like? Department of Finance is another mechanism that gets into economic and other fiscal data that'll help drive the alternatives. And then lastly, we have ADE with Doug Svensson here. He's our economic consultant. He too helps provide more tailored market projections and estimates for this process. So the scope of the analysis was to create 3 different comparative alternatives for the community to evaluate, and eventually your decision makers, that look at expanding housing options and expanding commercial options. So these 3 alternatives, these were designed in conjunction with city staff and the General Plan Advisory Committee. And the General Plan Advisory Committee is a separate body that is advisory. That's part of their role, is to look through the information prior to going out public. And they also make a formal recommendation to the Planning Commission and eventually the City Council. And as part of this, we worked with the Gpac and developed 3 different alternatives: the alternative A, alternative B, and alternative C. What I want to point out here is each of these are color coded, and this is done on purpose. You'll notice that as we go through this process, and if you looked at the alternatives report, a lot of the alternatives are very similar. And so we like to color code them so you can easily identify which one it is, A, B, or C. So alternative A is what we like to call a baseline scenario. That assumes a business as usual approach. That means that we look at what the city's current density and current intensity, which is your floor area ratio, how much square footage you can actually get on your parcel. And we look at what happens if nothing changed and that moved forward and you built the community out under your existing density and development regulations, what would the population be? What would your dwelling units be? What would the employment be? So that's important. Is just, if nothing ever changed and 20 years down the road, what could Solvang potentially look like if you stuck with the same development standards that are currently presented in your general plan? Alternative B takes a slightly different approach and provides an additional comparison, looking at what if the density increased slightly in specific designations, and we'll touch on those later in the presentation. And what does it look like if you allowed more square footage in your commercial areas? So more square footage in your tourist commercial or your downtown. What would that mean for employment? What would that mean for buildable area? Alternative C goes up one step for comparative reasons. What if you added more? And this is important because these are not the end all of scenarios. There's 3 that are here, but in the end, we're going to ask the community to provide your feedback on what you think is the best alternative, whether it's one of these 3 or it's a hybrid. There really is no right answer. And this is important for the community to weigh in to see how you feel Solvang should be in the next 20 years. It may be no growth. It may be moderate growth. It may be higher growth. And so that's what we're going to ask of everybody tonight. So Michael will, in a few minutes, will dive into each of these 3 alternatives in a bit more depth and discuss them. So each of these 3 land use alternatives I touched on, so the A, B, and C, they all include varying assumptions. So those assumptions are how we calculate what the amount of units would be, the amount of population, and amount of employment. So the density changes with each alternative. So in your first alternative, A, the density is what your current general plan says now. In alternative B, it stair steps and goes up a little bit more, and C up a little bit more. So each alternative has a different set of assumptions that we use to calculate. So then we come to the alternatives report. And what I would like to point out here is the alternatives report is broken into several sections. And the way that we've laid out the presentation tonight is it taps into each of those sections and follows the same streamline that the report does. So tonight we're going to go through the discussion of what's known as the focus area. Why is that important? What does that mean? And what are the implications of a focus area? And why was that selected as part of this process? We'll talk about the different redevelopment percentages. What does that mean? What does redevelopment percentage mean? And how does that affect growth and development? And then touch on the different changes in density and intensity, which is your square footage, as part of these 3 alternatives. So moving forward, Jordan Cowell, the assistant project manager, is going to step in, and he is going to explain the focus area and how we got to this point.
All right, thanks, Brent. When we're talking about the focus area, an important aspect of the alternatives process is identifying areas where there's the most opportunity for growth to occur. So some key factors that play an important role when identifying these areas is first and foremost is location. In this case, geographically speaking, where in Solvang is the potential for the creation and expansion of development? Are there existing utilities and access to existing infrastructure? Or does the location have the existing roadway capacity to withhold new development? And finally, how will the area or areas selected for growth be compatible with adjacent uses? So the consultant team has listened to the community, key stakeholders, the General Plan Advisory Committee, here we refer to as the Gpac, and staff throughout this process. And we've taken everything into consideration, the needs and expectations of the community. And what we did is we applied those to an area where we're going to here on out refer to as the focus area. This area is identified is an area within Solvang where change will likely occur, and it provides the city a starting point to develop policies which support the change, which will occur later on in the process. Next slide. So the focus area here, as you can see, it's the same for all 3 land uses. It's concentrated in the central core of the city. This is where most of the retail, commercial uses, higher density residential, and tourist commercial uses are located. This is also where Solvang has the most potential to accommodate new residential growth. Again, tying back to those 4 key factors that I discussed on the previous slide. And next slide. And then 2 existing land uses within that focus area were identified. First, you got high density residential, and second is tourist commercial. These are the 2 uses that can support potential future residential and non-residential development. And we did take a look at the areas outside of the focus area, but being predominantly single family, they're ultimately the least likely that can support additional growth in the future. Next slide. So this slide, we want to take a look with the existing 2 land use designations, the HDR and TC, high density residential and tourist commercial. They're given a new set of development assumptions for each alternative. One thing we want to note is the redevelopment percentage. We applied a 5 to 10% redevelopment percentage. If we were to, just to kind of explain what that means, is if we were to apply 100% redevelopment percentage, that would ultimately mean we would be bulldozing everything and redeveloping everything. That's not in reality going to happen. So we're basing everything on reality, which is going to be a 5 to 10% redevelopment. Your density range between the HDR is going to range between 8 to 32 and tourist commercial 0 to 32. The assumed typical density here is going to be 75% of the maximum units allowed. Again, this is tying back to being real. If you were to assume 100% density, that means once you apply your setbacks and development regulations and so forth, ultimately you're going to be going in at a 75% density.
I think what's important to point out here as well, back in this focus area, this boundary. So the focus area was primarily, it was originally drawn to include, as Jordan had mentioned, all the areas that had the most potential for future growth, if that is something that the community is looking for as part of this comparative analysis. And so the original boundaries of the focus area include exclusively all of the parcels that are designated HDR, high density residential, is in the general plan, and include the entire tourist commercial, which is the TRC in your zoning as well, which is your downtown. You will notice that the focus area is a very unique shape. There are some, what I like to call fingers, and they kind of stretch out along Mission Drive and 246, heading toward San Ynez and heading toward Buellton to the north and to the south. Those extensions, that was actually a recommendation from the Gpac. The Gpac felt that it's great to focus inward on the core of the community, but there's so much more to Solvang, and there's the gateways that you come into the community. And the Gpac felt it was important to extend that focus area along the major gateways into the city. And those might not necessarily have land use changes, but there could be potential future policies that talk about inviting gateways or entries into the community, just to create a more welcoming atmosphere for not only residents but also visitors. So that's why the focus area has some very interesting fingers. They follow major roadways and entry points into Solvang. Just wanted to capture that. So next, we're going to walk through the 3 alternatives and discuss the important factors, how we got to this stage, and then some of the results. So Michael.
Well, thank you, Brent, and good evening, everyone. So Brenton had already earlier on in the presentation had given a brief summary of each of the alternatives, and now we're hoping to do a little bit more of a deep dive and look at what are the outcomes, projected outcomes potentially, should these alternatives play out. So let's start with alternative A. And alternative A is like what we call a baseline scenario that is consistent with your existing 2008 general plan. This alternative can be considered a business as usual scenario in which there are no proposed density or intensity changes to any of the existing land use designations in the city. The development and zoning standards within this alternative would also remain unchanged. This is an important alternative to analyze because it is a point of comparison to all of the other alternatives, as it represents theoretically what the city could look like if development were to continue on the same trend that it has. So in this alternative, we assume that all currently vacant and underutilized parcels in the city would be developed at the average density and intensity of all other parcels in that land use designation. So by that, I mean, if the average density, for example, of all medium density residential was 5 dwelling units per acre in the entire city, then alternative A assumes that all vacant underutilized parcels would also be built out at 5 dwelling units to the acre. So based on these set of assumptions, alternative A projects that by 2040, there will be around 7,000 residents in the city, approximately 3,300 jobs, about 2,000 single family units, and over 880 multifamily units. Next slide.
And I think what's important to point out here is these are not net new. So these are not new units that are created by 2040. This is total. This includes units that are currently built within the city, along with new ones that could result from vacant underutilized development.
Yes, and thank you for clarifying that, Brendan. And so that is going to carry forward for the following two alternatives, B and C. It includes proposed projects, projects on the ground. It's not just net new. Thank you, Brendan. So next, moving on to alternative B. Alternative B is a medium density infill oriented alternative. Alternative B includes an increase to the maximum density in the high density residential land use designation. That increase would be from 20 dwelling units to acre to 24 dwelling units to the acre. Alternative B also includes allowing multifamily residential development in the tourist commercial designation at a maximum density of 20 dwelling units per acre. And currently, the existing tourist commercial land use designation doesn't allow residential uses as far as your existing general plan is concerned. This alternative would essentially modify that, and the tourist commercial land use designation would essentially become a mixed use designation that allows both commercial and residential uses. In order to accommodate this potential for additional dwelling units and square footage, this alternative includes increasing the existing FAR for this designation from 0.5 to 0.65 FAR, and also includes increasing the maximum height to 35 feet in the tourist commercial zone or land use designation. But besides those proposed changes, meaning the high density residential and tourist commercial land use designation changes, there are no other land use designation intensity or density changes to any of the remaining land use designations. So,
and I'll jump in here real quick. It's important to note that when you increase the FAR, that's increasing the allowable square footage on a parcel. So that allows more commercial development, more office development, more hospitality development within the TC, which subsequently would increase the capacity for more employment within Solvang.
So based on alternative B's projections, we can project that by 2040, if this alternative were to, as a point of comparison, were to be built out, there would be approximately 7,500 residents, my apologies, around 3,300 jobs, slightly over 2,000 single family homes, and slightly over 1,000 multifamily units. Next slide. So alternative C is an alternative that is slightly increased from alternative B. And this is alternative C can be looked at as more of a high density infill alternative as opposed to a medium density infill alternative. Similar to alternative B, alternative C includes an increase to the maximum density for the high density residential designation from 20 dwelling units to the acre to 32 dwelling units to the acre. This alternative also includes allowing multifamily residential development in the tourist commercial designation at a density of 32 dwelling units per acre. And again, I'm going to note that the existing tourist commercial land use designation in the existing general plan does not allow residential uses. So similar to alternative B, the tourist commercial in this alternative would essentially be another mixed use designation. And in order to help accommodate that additional growth, the FAR would increase from 0.5 to an FAR of just 1, and also includes the increase in the height from 245 feet as a maximum height. But besides those two designation intensity and density changes, there are no other proposed density or intensity changes for the remaining land use designations. If we look at the projections and based on their assumptions, it is projected that by 2040, there would be approximately 7,800 residents, over 7,800 residents, over 3,400 jobs, and over 1,200 multifamily units. The single family units would stay the same between this alternative and alternative B, because there were no proposed changes to any of the single family land use designations as part of these alternatives. And I'll hand it back to you, Brent.
Thank you. So that's an overview of the process of the alternatives, and then the 3 alternatives that are before you tonight for comparison and eventual community review and Gpac review, and then decision maker discussion. I will point out that this was an overview of the alternatives. The alternatives report, which is on the Plan Solvang website, goes into this even deeper. So I do highly recommend that everyone has a chance to review that and take a look at that this evening. So we're going to pivot and talk about the evaluation. So what are the end results? Michael touched on each of the results of each of the alternatives, but sometimes it's better to see all of those lined up, because as mentioned, we want to look at these from a comparative angle to see what the difference is and what the implications are between these 3 as stated. So I'm going to walk through the land use alternatives evaluation, and as part of this, other teaming partners I've mentioned with ADE and DKS are going to step in and talk about different components that relate to their respective sections. So first off, I'll touch on the range of housing. So we had mentioned that there was multifamily units and there were single family units. The total units per alternative is shown here in the bar chart. So alternative A, which is the business as usual, has an estimated 2,928 units. That is inclusive of the amount of units which are currently built right now in the city, which is approximately 2,500. So right now in Solvang, there are 2,500 dwelling units. So then you can see there, when you take the 2,500 out of the 2,928, you have a net new increase of about 274 approximately. So as you can see, each of the alternatives, they stair step slightly. And that's linked back to the fact that the density stair steps slightly as you move up through each of them, just to show what the implications would be if that change did occur. It's important to note too, what is considered single family and what do we consider multifamily? We throw those around, but there's lots of different housing typologies within each of those. So single family is your typical single family detached home. Single family also includes 2 to 4 units attached. Sometimes that's a townhome style development. You can have single family attached or mobile homes. So that's typically what we would include as part of single family. So that falls into that dark blue there in the bar chart. Multifamily, that typically consists of condominiums, apartments, mixed use, which if an alternative moves forward that has residential in the form of multifamily in the TC, that's most likely what you would find would be a mixed use format where we would still retain the commercial or retail use with a residential component in the same structure, and also live work units as well. So this kind of gives you that side-by-side comparison to how each of these alternatives lands. Then we come down to the employment. So here's your A, B, C again. This is total employment. This includes not only the jobs that are currently existing within the city of Solvang, but then this also includes new ones that would be created by any changes to land use, specifically tied to the non-residential intensity, which increases the square footage, which allows for future employment. So the way that we look at the employment is there's several factors that we use to calculate employment. We look at one, employment acreage. So that's the percentage of the vacant and underutilized acreage within each of the non-residential land use designations. And we look at that for expectations for development. We look at your FAR. So Michael had mentioned the current floor area ratio, that's the amount of square footage that can be built on a lot, is right now 0.5. And that is in your existing general plan. Alternative B and C slightly increase that. So when that floor area ratio expands, that allows more room for more non-residential, commercial, retail, office uses, thus more employment. So the employment goes up, and you start to see that as you look across the top bar between the three alternatives. And then lastly, we look at percent by employment type. And Doug can talk on that a little bit more. So the next factor is we get into housing affordability. And this is a really important piece. And I'm going to ask Doug to step in and explain how we evaluate that.
Thank you, Brent. One of the requirements the city is needing to meet in its general plan update is its regional housing needs allocation. And over the next 8 or 9 years, the SBCAG has assigned the city roughly 191 new units, of which 112 need to meet certain affordability categories. So looking at the chart here, as many of you are aware, the price of single family homes in Solvang is up around 900,000 or more currently, or as of this last year. But when we look at the affordability guidelines, even at the most upper end of that, which we call the moderate income level, for a family of 4, the highest price unit that they can afford is just under 670,000. So you can see there's a large discrepancy between what's considered affordable and what the actual market prices are in Solvang. And so it's most likely that the city is going to be able to meet its affordability goals more through multifamily housing than through new single family housing. And so we've evaluated the alternatives based on the extent to which the multifamily housing that would be built under each alternative could meet the goals that are outlined in the RENA. Alternative A has the least amount of new development, and here I'm going to focus more on the increment of growth and not the total growth, which you've been looking at in the previous slide. So alternative A would add 362 new units total to the inventory in Solvang, but of those, only 87 would be multifamily units. And so that's fewer than the 112 that you would need to meet these affordability guidelines. So there's a good chance that if you move forward with the existing general plan and alternative A, it would be very difficult to meet those guidelines. But alternative B would add 284 multifamily units. These are just our assumptions based on what Michael and Brent have described before. So that's more than double than you need to find. So a number of those could be affordable, others could be more market rate, and you would meet those guidelines pretty easily. And then alternative C would add 422 multifamily units. All of the alternatives have the same number of single family at 275 units. So from the standpoint of housing affordability, alternatives B and C would make it easier for the city to meet those goals. Next slide. Next, we've also evaluated the alternatives in terms of their impact to city finances and the ability to fund services going forward. And all of the alternatives are heavily focused on developing new housing and not as much on commercial development, although there is some growth in retail and tourism in each of the alternatives. And I'm going to get into this a little more later in the presentation, but in general terms, residential units often don't generate enough tax revenue to fully pay for services that they need. And a lot of that has to do with Proposition 13 and restrictions on the property tax revenue that the city gets. But also in Solvang, as we'll talk about a little later, obviously tourism is a big driver in the economy, generates a lot of sales tax and other revenues that the city uses. So when we're focused mainly on housing development, it's not unexpected that in and of themselves, they would generate some higher costs for services than the revenues that they generate. But it's important to point out here that we're looking at just the increment of growth in each of these alternatives, not the total city land use pattern. So for example, alternative C is showing a negative $398,000. That would only be the incremental change from the new land uses over a period of time. So that would build up over, a number of years. The general plan horizon is 20 years. If it took 20 years, incrementally, gradually, that would develop. But for comparison, pardon me, I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is going to be a little bit scratchy tonight. In 2019, before the pandemic hit, it was a normal budget year for the city. The city had a routine surplus in its general fund of more than $400,000. So if alternative C were suddenly implemented in 1 year, the city would still have had a positive balanced budget. The level of impact here would not have been enough to create an out of balance budget. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Also, this analysis doesn't account for any existing capacity of the city to extend services to new development without necessarily having to spend more money. So for example, if we put in a new housing project over this next year, the city may or may not need more police officers or other service personnel. It's likely that that development would just get services from existing city staff and so forth. Obviously, at some point in time, as the city grows, the city will need to add more staff, and these costs kind of reflect the average cost that the city experiences as it grows. But the city adopts a new budget every year, and it's evaluating its revenues and costs each year as it makes those budget decisions. So it will have the ability to make adjustments as new services are needed for new development and considering what revenues are available to pay for those services. The non-residential development in each of these alternatives does give a positive fiscal benefit. And again, I'm going to talk more about that in a while. But also, it's not unreasonable to think that existing tourism will continue to grow in existing businesses that are already in town. And as that happens, that will continue to create additional revenues that can then help pay for services to handle the new residential development in the alternatives. So I think it's fair to say that this is a worst case projection, but it's important for the city to understand the potential for the need to spend more money on services, and so it can plan ahead and factor that into its annual budget process. So I think I'll stop there, Brett, and let you move on.
Perfect. Thank you, Doug. Thank you. So I think as we roll out of the land use alternatives evaluation, before we end that and start talking about mobility and circulation, and then bring it back to tourism and market analysis that the ADE prepared, I always like to show the results. I'm a numbers guy, so I like to see everything in front of me, and especially for comparative purposes. So I thought that having a table like this is really important for everybody to see. This shows the overall results of the three alternatives. So A is in the green, B is in the magenta, C is in the teal. The top line is the population or residents. Second line down is your employment, that's your jobs. Now this is total, all of these are total. These include units that are on the ground today, so that's that existing column. So the current population in Solvang, based on the 2020 census, is 6,126. Current jobs in the city is approximately 3,200, and the current dwelling units are about 2,500. And so this shows that stair-step comparative view of how each of the alternatives compare to each other. And then we've gone through several of the evaluations, which are the implications from that. Now we've talked about what's the fiscal health, what is the health, what is the effects on the range of housing and the range of housing types. And now we're going to shift the discussion and talk about, well, what about mobility? What about traffic? What does this all entail, and how do these alternatives affect that? Because that's also another big component. Solvang, unlike most communities, has a highway that goes right through it. So Mission Drive 246, there's a lot of traffic that goes through the city that necessarily the city doesn't have control over. So it's important that we analyze that, and that's where we bring in DKS. And I'm going to hand it over to Jim Damkowicz, and he's going to take the mobility discussion from here.
Okay, thank you, Brent. So as Brent mentioned, a key part of this is land use. That will affect mobility, not only for vehicles but for all modes. And it's important to note that this is a comprehensive view of all modes. As you are well aware, the city should pride itself on being a very pedestrian-friendly and pedestrian-oriented downtown. And those are great assets and should be maximized to the greatest extent possible. Also, this is in the world of SB 743, so vehicle miles of traveled is the key metric. But also just land use efficiency. So being able to have all modes interact, not conflict with one another, but work in the most efficient way possible so that all modes operate efficiently and safely. So I will point out that the things I'm going to talk about, they're called alternatives, mobility alternatives, but really they can be integrated into any one of the land use alternatives that have been already described. So they're not per se alternatives in of themselves, but they certainly could be made that way if so desired by the public. Next slide. Okay, first we're going to talk about that pedestrian and bicycle system. And I will say this is a really good time for looking at the circulation element, specifically because there's been some recent studies that will help inform this process. One of which is the San Diego Bicycle Master Plan, but there's also others. There's the San Diego Valley Traffic Circulation and Safety Study that had a 2020 timestamp, and then the Walker Parking Study as well. So a lot of good recent resources to draw from that are specific to the city of Solvang. So walking and bicycling options. So, I don't need to go through each one of these, but, definitely looking for infrastructure enhancements and treatments to slow auto and truck traffic and reduce conflicts. I will point out that AB 43 was passed. So as of January 1st, there's a lot greater flexibility to reduce speed limits. The process to reduce speed limits for roadways that had a history of speeding and the safety issues that go along with that, really local agencies had their hands tied because the process and the analysis for modifying or changing speed limits was fairly rigid. It was based on the 85th percentile speed that is observed. And many local agencies were actually frightened to do speed studies because many resulted in having to increase the speed limit. So the good news is that local agencies such as the city of Solvang now, and this includes state highways as well, so it applies to Caltrans as well, have much greater latitude, if you will, to reduce speed limits for purposes of safety and so on and so forth. So just want to do a shout out about that. Visual treatments to improve awareness of crossings and other facilities. Here, a big thing is trying to reduce the ped crossing distance. There are some very heavily utilized intersections along Mission Boulevard that range from 500 to 600 pedestrian movements in the peak hour. Those are significant. And so crossings are very important, and the concern of uncontrolled mid-block crossings are obviously a huge concern, and typically those mid-block uncontrolled crossings are one of the key safety issues in many cities, Solvang included. So that kind of gets into the enhanced crosswalk marking, signage, and signals, wider sidewalks, that reduces the crossing distance as well. And then obviously the creation of local bike systems to provide good opportunities for cyclists not to have to use State Route 246 or Mission Boulevard per se. Obviously there's a lot of vehicle activity there, that's not going to go away. And so we're to try to reduce the bicycle and vehicle conflicts that can arise. It's always good to give alternative routes, parallel facilities, and so on and so forth that are safer for bicyclists. So build off the goals of the downtown Solvang parking study, which I mentioned, which was done by Walker Consultants. And parking, the city has a great asset. It brings in a lot of visitors, and it does have a very functional downtown, which means that parking can be used as a revenue generator, and that revenue can be used for providing infrastructure improvements. It can be used for a multitude of various things, including transit, depending on how you want to structure it. But that is an opportunity that the city has to take advantage of that as a means of raising revenue. And one of the possible recommendations is providing a 3-hour limit in the most congested parking areas to try to improve or increase the turnover rate, which also can generate revenue per count. So next slide. And so wayfinding, and this kind of gets into that efficiency concept that I brought up. Wayfinding is actually been given a lot of life and a lot of credence in other areas as a means of reducing VMT. And you might ask, well, how does that work? Well, if people really have good information and understand where particularly where good parking is or available parking, then they're not spending a lot of time circling around, aimlessly trying to find parking where it may not exist. And so, so wayfinding is very important for motorists, but also very important for residents and tourists and so on and so forth to navigate through the city. You may think, well, Solvang is a pretty easy downtown to figure out, but you'd be surprised how efficient and how much good wayfinding signage can improve one's experience within the city. Next slide. Okay, and this kind of gets into that what I mentioned before is wayfinding and parking. So I won't belabor the point, but many folks expend a lot of VMT looking for parking. So if there's a really good wayfinding program that is tied directly to your parking, it can be a win-win. And I've done studies in other areas that attempt to do just this. And it's kind of funny, a good example of a city who has done a really good job providing adequate parking, but the wayfinding component was not included is the city of San Luis Obispo. Their parking garages are so beautiful, people don't recognize them as parking garages. And it's very difficult to find parking in San Luis Obispo, and they could certainly benefit from better wayfinding to their parking. But some of the things that can help with that is advanced parking guidance systems at parking lots, the management of those lots and enforcement, public-private partnerships with valet service, and then crowdsourced guidance systems like smartphone apps and so on and so forth that can be used to help folks find parking and find it quickly and efficiently. Next slide. So, and then pedestrian streets and corridors. So, you know, I talked about this before. There's a couple of key issues that the city can decide in terms of its pedestrians. And one of the things that it came up in the circulation study and safety study was this concept of pedestrian scrambles. And what that is that instead of having discrete individual movements for pedestrians to navigate across an intersection, it essentially, this takes more time, but it allows all movements, not only across the street, but diagonally as well. So all movements at an intersection are allowed in a pedestrian scramble. And you might think that this is going to create a lot of delay and a lot of traffic delay because it just simply takes longer. But just given the amount of pedestrians at some of your key intersections, and that's at Adderdag or intersections that were identified as good pedestrian scramble locations, it actually can improve traffic flow because you're taking care of a high volume of pedestrians all at once, and then you don't have those interrupting pedestrian crossing cycles for the main crossing and then the side streets as well. So it can be a very efficient treatment at intersections and something that should be considered here in Solvang. Next slide. Another pedestrian concept is pedestrian-only street. So basically closing off sections of roadways to vehicle through movements. And this is going on in the city of Santa Barbara. This is being considered in other cities in the Central Coast where you have a main street, in this case Mission Boulevard, and you have a number of side streets that access Mission Boulevard. And typically these are very commercial oriented side streets. So pedestrian traffic and points of interest within those blocks that lead up to Mission Boulevard are typically commercial in nature. These are excellent candidates for basically setting up bollards that do not allow a vehicle to access Mission Boulevard. Basically, you pinch it off. You can still allow vehicles to enter the street to park, so you don't necessarily have to give up your on-street parking supply, which is, you know, a key issue in the city. But basically, the cars park, and soon that parking is filled up, and it's a pedestrian-only use of that street. And I'm here in Sacramento as well as Mintier Harnish, and this is going on a lot in Sacramento. And it's kind of nice because you can do a trial basis. You can set up these plastic bollards, and then if it works really well, you can replace those with something more permanent if that's something that the community wants. A really good example is within the city of Santa Barbara and Sola Street. They set up as it was a side street to State Street, which is their main drag. And they set up plastic bollards. Everybody loved it. They had a grid system, which was a nice asset. So you really weren't sacrificing access in any way by closing the street to vehicles. And now it's permanent. And they're looking for other good examples to do that. The Fjord Drive extension. So this idea has been around for a while, and I will say that this is something that could help relieve and take traffic off, at least on the west end of Mission Boulevard, to provide an alternative. It's not a full bypass by any stretch, but it certainly can help. And so this is something that, as part of a circulation element update, we certainly want to look at and consider. Next slide. Another thing I do want to point out in terms of one thing that we don't talk much about, because we're trying to keep this at a pretty high level, but there's also, the intersection control type, the circulation element, or the circulation study that was done in 2020 looked at various controls. There's stop control, signal, enhanced signal controls, but also roundabouts. And so that's something that we could possibly explore further if it's so desired, in terms of what control types at certain intersections make the most sense. Roundabouts were recommended at Skid Mesa Road and 246, as well as Alamo Pintado Road and 246, kind of have your bookends as roundabouts as you enter into the city, kind of as a gateway as well, which is always a nice thing to have as well. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. In terms of the land use alternatives, we did a trip generation analysis. And so really the important thing here is to look at the relative differences between the three alternatives. As you recall, alternative A is your business as usual land use. And this is total land use, not net new. And so I think the titles of some of these bars probably can be clarified, but so roughly scenario A, you're generating around 26,000 vehicle trips, and these are vehicle trips, not total person trips. You increase that by roughly 3,000 daily trips when you move to alternative B, and then alternative C, relative to the business as usual, another 6,000 trips. And thousands of daily trips, it's hard to gauge what that is. A good rule of thumb is your peak hour volume is roughly about 10% of your daily. So alternative B, making that assumption, alternative B would roughly add around 300 peak hour trips in the city. And then alternative C would add roughly around 600 total peak hour trips. Now, how many of those are going to end up on 246? We did do an analysis using the SBCAG model. Now, keep in mind that these scenarios weren't explicitly modeled using the SBCAG model. That will come as part of the EIR. So this is just a trip generation assessment, but we do know, using the SBCAG model, of the trips that are using Mission Boulevard, how many are internal trips to Solvang, meaning that the trip begins and ends within the city. Only 13% of your total vehicle trips do that. It's not a big number. Around 57% of those trips have at least one trip in the city, meaning that either the trip starts in Solvang, but it ends outside of Solvang, and then vice versa. And then roughly around 33% of the trips are just through trips that neither, no stop at all in Solvang, they're just passing through. So just based on those percentages, we reduced the daily trips to, okay, how many trips would probably show up on Route 246 or Mission Boulevard? And it's roughly that 54 plus 33, so about 87%. And again, looking at that, you're adding about 300 peak hour trips for alternative B over the business as usual, and another 500 trips for alternative C. So some of those will be just internal to the city of Solvang, but most of them are going to show up on State Route 246. Next slide.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Jim, for walking us through the traffic mobility and trip generation. And it's important to point out, as Jim had mentioned at the beginning of his discussion, that these mobility alternatives are not necessarily, or options, I'll call them options, are not necessarily linked to the land use alternatives. So there's the ability based on community preference and then eventual consideration for city council to have a whole wide range of mobility options. So there's a big pot of different aspects that the community can choose based on preference, whether it's expanded sidewalks, whether it's, as Jim had touched on, the pedestrian scrambles, whether it is more bicycle lanes, whether it's if a Fjord Drive extension is something the community wishes to explore further. Again, there's a lot of different components that can be put together in each of these land use alternatives. So that's something to consider and think about moving forward. As we start to round out, I appreciate everyone hanging in there. I know this is a lot of information, but we want to make sure that we present everything to its fullest here. I'm going to have ADE, Doug Svensson with ADE step in, and he's going to give a brief overview on the tourism retail market analysis, and then we'll wrap it up talking about the survey and open up for public comment. Doug?
Thanks, Brent. We thought it would be important to really look more closely at the entire economy for Solvang to kind of create some context for this alternatives analysis and the general plan update, and also to help us develop the fiscal impact model that we've used to evaluate the alternatives. And so we accessed some data on visitors based on cell phone and GPS data records. And so we have a more complete view of just how many people come to Solvang and the surrounding region and what their economic impact really is. So based on that data, we estimate in 2019, during the calendar year, the city had a little over 1.5 million visitors. That's roughly 8.2% of all the visitors that came to Santa Barbara County in that year. And actually, if we take the 12 months just leading up to when the pandemic hit at the end of February in 2020, the Solvang had up to 1.6 million. So that's a little less than Buellton, but a little more than Santa Ynez. But we estimate that those visitors spend 132.7, almost $133 million a year in Solvang, in lodging, restaurants, gasoline, gift shops, all of that. All of that spending supports about 1,400 jobs, or about 1/3 of all the jobs in the city of Solvang. And Brad, I'm going to go a little more on that slide because I want to talk about this graph a little bit, just to talk about the trends. It generates about $6 million in city revenue. So this chart at the bottom shows the time between January of 2019 and June of last year in 2021. And Solvang is the yellow line, Buellton is the blue line, and Santa Ynez is the gray line. And then across the bottom, you have Los Olivos. But you can see that the pattern of visitorship is pretty similar among the cities. The first part of the graph down to the bottom end there is prior to the pandemic, and then that hole there is when the pandemic hit in March of 2020. It did come back up in the summer of that year, but then it went down in the winter. And normally Solvang, as you know, has a big visitor complement in December, in November, December, early January. That didn't happen 2020. So we estimate overall between what had happened prior to the pandemic and the 12 months after March 1st of 2020, the city lost about 200,000 visitors from what it had before. Okay, next slide. We've also done an analysis of the retail market in Solvang. We estimate the total purchasing power at almost $164 million. And this is again keyed to the time before the pandemic in 2019. Of that amount, visitors spend almost 94 million. Households that live in the city, about 63 million. And then the business community and commuters add a little bit to that. So The actual sales were 142 million. So there's about $22 million in purchasing power that's not being captured in Solvang, but most of that is in automobile sales and other large scale discount stores. So they're not necessarily opportunities that the city can try to recapture. So I guess the bottom line is the city is really dependent on tourism, but it's doing about as well as it can do on the retail market within that. It is interesting to note that the building supply and home improvement stores in town do very well and are exceeding expectations in terms of local purchasing power and are drawing sales in from folks that live around the city in the region. Okay, last slide. So in terms of the fiscal health of the community, again, getting back to what we talked about with the alternatives, this kind of creates the context for that. In 2019, the city general fund had 9.2 million in revenues and 8.8 million in costs. So that's the $400,000 surplus that I mentioned before. Tourism generates 2/3 of city revenue. That's mostly transient occupancy tax, but also about half the sales tax that gets generated and property tax and other revenues that the city collects. We estimate that it really only costs about 3 million for city services to support tourism. Granted, I know there's a lot of traffic related to visitors, but a lot of other services are not needed by visitors. So that creates additional revenue to help support services in the residential neighborhoods. And the reason that's important is because existing homes in Solvang have an assessed value that they pay tax on of only about $400,000. So that means that the property tax assessments are way behind market conditions, and that's due to the way Proposition 13 works. So that really reduces the amount of property tax. The city only gets a little over 6% of what property owners pay anyway. The rest of it goes to the county and to other schools and other taxing agencies. But because there's this disparity in assessed values, residential is not producing the amount of property tax that otherwise it'd expect. Now, the new housing in the alternatives will have higher assessed values than the existing housing, and so that reduces some of that impact. But really, the housing in the alternatives, that impact is pretty small in comparison to what tourism generates and drives in the city in terms of revenue capacity. So the fiscal health of the community is much more dependent on ups and downs of the tourism and the retail sectors than the marginal growth in housing that we're talking about for the general plan. So anyway, I'll stop there. I know we've gone on a long time here, but I'm happy to answer any questions later as we get into it.
Perfect. Thank you, Doug. I appreciate it. And to round us out, Jordan, take us home.
All right, so by now I'm sure a lot of you are ready to provide comments and are sitting at the edge of your seat. I assure you we're almost at that point. But before we do, we want to let everybody know that tonight is not your last opportunity to provide comments and feedback. We want to let you know that there's an additional opportunity to do so. We invite and strongly encourage everyone to participate in a community survey that we created. The survey is based on the information that we provided this evening, as well as information that's outlined in the alternatives report. The survey is going to be open until February 4th. All the responses that we receive on the survey are going to be provided in a summary, and then we'll take that to council for review and consideration. So I want to walk everybody through how you can access the survey. You can access it through the project website by going to the landing page that we created for this effort. You can get to the landing page by visiting plansolvang.com. Again, that's plansolvang.com. Once you're on the homepage, click on the land use alternatives. You can see in this photo, it's got a neon green box around it. It's located on the upper right portion of the banner at the top of the page. This is where you're going to find all the information for this effort. You'll find meeting information, including tonight's meeting. You'll find where you can download the alternatives report. There will also be a link to take the survey. So as a reminder, the survey is going to be open until February 4th. And again, all your feedback, it will be presented at council for consideration.
And it's important to note on that same landing page that Jordan's talking about, shown on here on the screen where that green box is at the top. The presentation tonight, we're recording this presentation. And so within a few days, expect that this presentation will also be on the website. So if there's anything you want to go back and review, you'll have the ability to do so. This presentation will be online through the remainder of the project on the project website. So this concludes our presentation. So I really appreciate everybody for hanging in there. So what we'd like to do now is open this up for public comment Q&A. If you've participated in our past online general plan events, this should be very, very similar. Through Zoom, we just ask that everyone uses the raise hand feature or symbol in Zoom to raise your hand. City Manager Xenia Bradford is going to watch those who raise their hand and then elevate to speak, and then you'll be able to ask your question of not only city staff but of the consultant team here if you have any questions or any comments. We are keeping tabs on everything that is said tonight. If there are questions and they're more in-depth, we plan on providing written responses afterwards. That'll be part of that summary that Jordan talked about. So stay tuned for that. We just ask that everybody limit your comments to 3 minutes. There's a large group here tonight, and we just want to make sure that everybody has the ability and the opportunity to be able to ask a question or provide comments if they so wish. So I'm going to stop sharing screen and hand it over to Xenia.
Thank you, Brent and the team. If anybody would like to ask a question, I see a couple of raised hands, but anyway, raise your hand using Zoom if you'd like to get in line to speak. And first we have Joan Ricci. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. This was quite informative and I really appreciate it. There's so many things that I really want to talk about. Particularly the multifamily approach, the alternative that talks about the most multifamily approach. I'm curious about the analysis that you did with that and the kinds of jobs that would be generated and the kind of family sustaining wage that would be generated by that. And then my second question is really around the trip generation, the pedestrian traffic mobility issues. How did you take into consideration the impact of the new Shumash Cultural Museum on the traffic implications on 246, given they're asserting that there will be 1 million visitors per year in that generation?
So your question regarding the multifamily housing, and I'm assuming you're talking about, is it alternative C you're
Yes.
referring to?
Yes.
How we came to the density conclusion, or how that was analyzed?
Yes, and really I'm curious about, there's an increase in jobs, and I'm curious about the breakdown in the kinds of jobs that you refer to: retail, manufacturing. I don't have them all in front of me, but retail, manufacturing, there were all kinds of jobs. I'm really concerned about the wage of those jobs, the wage amounts of those jobs, and how those are family sustaining wages so that we can meet the kinds of housing affordability levels that you're projecting.
Doug, do you want to take a stab at this? Go for it.
Thank you.
It's important to distinguish between what the existing general plan will allow in terms of job growth, and then the additional changes that would be part of the alternatives. The changes that are part of the alternatives are primarily to open up new opportunities in tourism and retail types of development downtown. But when we look at the projected growth in jobs generally and look at the other land use designations in the general plan, we do expect, and I think there are a couple projects that the city has got in front of it now, we do expect growth in healthcare in the community and other job sectors that are not necessarily tourism related, but those are all jobs that can continue to occur and grow under the existing general plan. So they're not specifically addressed in these alternatives. So those jobs, healthcare, some of those jobs are relatively well-paying jobs and sustainable. A lot of tourism and retail jobs are less well-paying, and except for those who are in management and so forth. And so that does kind of speak to the need to meet the affordability guidelines. And so there's
Most definitely.
a lot of focus on the multifamily as a way of keeping housing prices lower so that they are more affordable for the workforce who's actually employed in the city. But there is a mix of jobs that will occur in the future.
Thank you.
And then in regards to the trip generation, Jim,
Brent, I
did you
can
have
answer.
anything to add on that final question? Jim Damquich.
Yeah, so no, that's a very good point. I will say that the trip generation analysis was specific to the land use scenarios within the city of Solvang. So a facility like the Chumash Museum is not explicitly addressed in those numbers, but I will say that when we get to the EIR phase, we will be applying the SBCAG travel demand model. They're in the process of updating that model to an updated baseline, and it'll be interesting to see if they reflect that development within their future land use. If they don't, we can certainly add it in to make sure it's reflected. And you're right, that will have implications to traffic on Route 246 through the city on Mission Boulevard, and possibly increase those through trips. So I appreciate the comment.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have John, Lentz, and Duncan. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is a very interesting process, obviously, and there's a lot here, but I would like to bring you down from 30,000 feet to look at the details of the language in the alternatives, alternatives B and alternative C. You're talking about increasing the maximum unit number from 20 to 24 in alternative B and from 20 to 32 in alternative C. The problem is the high density residential is not all zoned for 20 units per acre. This is actually a range of zoning between 8 units per acre and 20 units per acre. And if you look at the zoning map for the city, you'll see that there are parts of this designation that have 8, 12, 16, and 20. So what I'm wondering about is, are you simply proposing in each of these, you would do 20% in alternative B and 60% in alternative C? Or is the assumption that all of these are going to go to 24 or 32? And in that case, there's some radical increases in the density of these parcels. The other thing I'd like to call your attention to is that including Mission Oaks, where I live, in this high density residential area is very misleading and inappropriate. I don't know how this originally got the designation, how Mission Oaks got that, but we have a density of 1.8 units per acre. And that's how it's built. We have 84 units on 48 acres. And the definition for high density residential is, as I said, between 8 and 20 units per acre. So it just doesn't fit from square one. And if you applied these multiples to us, we would be talking about 1,300% increase in the density of where we are. So I do hope you're going to look very carefully at these high density residential parcels and see what specific language achieves the goals that you want to get to in each case. Thank you.
Sure, and I appreciate the comments. And in regards to your second one about Mission Oaks, where you reside, that's a good question. Having it designated as HDR with such a low density that doesn't meet consistency with the general plan. There's obviously some history to that we're not aware of. When it comes down to the question regarding the HDR, so your general plan, you are right that there are several different zoning districts that have different densities that are lower than what we're showing as part of the alternatives. So you have your base general plan layer, which allows, and existing right now, allows up to 20 dwelling units an acre. There are several zoning districts underneath that, and that's the finer grain detail. Those zoning districts implement your general plan. So as long as those zoning districts are consistent, so your existing high density residential allows between 8 to 20 dwelling units an acre. And as you pointed out, the zoning districts that implement that throughout the city and their range are anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12 to 16 and up. As part of the analysis, what we do is we look at the general plan and its full maximum build out. So under the general plan, those parcels can have the potential to go up to 20 dwelling units an acre. Now, it's not to say they will eventually, just based on the zoning. And what we'll do is later on in this process, remember, this is just the 30,000 high foot level. This is, we're looking at it from the upper end view of what a maximum potential build out would be. Later on in the process, when we start to get into the land use element more in depth, we'll actually start to analyze those zones and get down to that finer grain detail where you're at. So you're actually 2 steps ahead of where we're at this moment. But you're right, there are ranges, but we're evaluating what the general plan is saying and what that build out could be as part of that.
Well, I've always heard that when you have land use designation and zoning that is not 100% congruent, the more restrictive of the two is the one that applies.
It can, but your designation, if you had a parcel that's zoned 8 units an acre, which is consistent with your general plan, which allows 8 to 20, you the property owner hypothetically could rezone that to a higher density and would still be consistent with the general plan. So we need to look at that full build out. It's not saying that is going to occur. It's just we need to analyze that for the environmental potential that could happen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, next up we have Mayor Pro Tem Infante. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Senior. One comment and one question, please. Looking or listening to the traffic analysis, I saw things like slowing down the speed limit, pedestrian scrambles, things of that nature on Mission, blockages of the street on Mission. This is all controlled by Caltrans, and I think any reference to it in the general plan is superfluous because we can't accomplish it without Caltrans. My one question is, in considering alternatives B and C, where you're increasing substantially the amount of residences in this city, has there been any consideration on utilities, water and wastewater specifically?
So your traffic comment, Jim Damkwich, do you want to jump in there and then we can round it out?
The statement is absolutely correct. Yep. Caltrans is their facility, so any modifications or treatments on Mission Boulevard, State Route 246 will have to be done in partnership with Caltrans. The good news is that Caltrans, in my opinion, has become a bit more friendlier to work with in terms of pedestrian treatments, bicycle treatments. Safety is a major concern of theirs, and I think anything under the auspices of safety wins the day at Caltrans. but a lot of these things may be not favored by Caltrans, but we'll have to just cross that road when we get there.
Thank you, Jim.
But
And
it's
then
an accurate statement.
And then in regards to the utilities, so as part of this analysis, there was not an additional layer of analysis that dealt with your utilities, your water, your sewer, your electricity demand for new units. The one difference is here is when an alternative is selected, that's not the end of an analysis on an alternative. It moves to the environmental impact report, which takes higher scrutiny and looks at all the environmental implications and potential mitigations to offset that. What comes out of the EIR will eventually drive potentially new programs that will require the city to evaluate or expand infrastructure at that point. So the EIR is going to serve as the primary tool to evaluate the utility and infrastructure capacity moving forward.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, next comment we have from Dennis Beebe. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, my questions are back to traffic and circulation, and particularly slide 31, where there's a lot of data given verbally. We showed a comparison of trips between the three alternatives, but I wasn't sure what the current trips were, and I don't even know what a trip is. You didn't define it. And the other related question is, I think you said 33% of these numbers represent through traffic. They don't stop or start in Solvang. And in my opinion, that's the biggest problem with traffic. But I don't see why that should increase just because we build more houses in Solvang. So how is the through traffic increasing and why? Maybe it's the Shumash Museum, I don't know. But could you explain what trips are? Could you explain what the current trips are? And could you explain the through trips and where does that number come from?
Sure. So, and I did go by that pretty quick, so I apologize. But the analysis of trips are vehicle trips. They are based on the ITE trip generation manual, and it looks at land uses, land use types, and the trip generation of vehicle trips associated with each of those land use types. So that was the analysis that was performed just to give everyone kind of a sense of what those land use alternatives mean when it comes to total trip generation of vehicle trips. And so that's what a trip is. It's a vehicle. For the 33% that are through trips, that is a snapshot. So based on, and that was something that was determined through using the SBCAG regional travel demand model. There are other ways to actually measure that, but they're a bit more expensive and so on and so forth. But the 33%, you're right, it's through trips. The city has no control over those trips. The city has nothing to do with those trips, and yet those trips are traversing through your downtown. And it kind of gets back to the statement about Caltrans, that throughput, especially for goods movement and so on and so forth, is a key mission of Caltrans. And so they're very protective and covet that. And so that can make working with them difficult sometimes when a state facility is also a main street for a jurisdiction. So that 33% is a snapshot. The question regarding the Chumash Museum, if that does occur in the future, that is something, a trip generator that and an attraction that could generate more through trips through the city of Solvang. So that's something to be determined through travel demand modeling when we get to the EIR phase. That's the good news, is that we can take a much more detailed analysis approach at that time to address what the implications are of a facility such as that.
So just one follow-up. If 33% is a snapshot of current, in alternative C, where the increase is just due to trips associated with increased housing, maybe increased employment in Solvang, is there any reason to think that 33% applies to alternative C just as it does to current?
The assumption there is that 33%, we kept that constant. And so the difference that you see in total vehicle trip activity is related to the land use alternatives and the assumptions of those alternatives. So that way you can isolate exactly the trip generation characteristics of the land use alternatives.
Okay, thank you.
And to let you know, I think you also asked what is currently out there right now. On State Route 246 on the west side of the city, it's roughly 22,000 daily trips. On the east side, it's about 20,000 daily trips. So whatever that net new land use that is being that is going into these land use alternatives, and I kind of said it's about 2,500 additional daily trips for alternative B. Alternative C generates roughly about 4,300 more daily trips. So you would expect volumes on 246 to start approaching 30,000, assuming those through trips also increase, because obviously areas outside of Solvang are also growing and generating trips that will likely use 246.
Okay, next up we have Ian Jacobson. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My concern is primarily about parking in high density areas. One of the reasons we live in Solvang is that when we lived in San Jose, we lived in a high density area. And the assumption was 1 car per unit, which was completely unrealistic. It was the sort of thing where we had to have our friends park in the Target parking lot half a mile away, and we would go and pick them up and bring them to our house. We don't want something like that here. And any assumption like St. George was making about half a parking space per unit is, well, anyone who thinks that that is okay should be condemned to live in that sort of an environment for a year. The other thing is sidewalks. There's a lack of sidewalks for the residential part of town, and especially on streets like Laurel, where there's a good deal of student traffic coming to and from school bus stops and people walking up Alisal, that there needs to be a good sidewalk network within the residential area of town. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we appreciate those, and all those comments, just like the ones you had brought up, actually can those can have some impacts on future goals, policies, and programs that are carried forward as part of the mobility element. So thank you.
Okay, next we have Lindy Johansson. It's the email. There you go. You're muted.
Thank you. I'm speaking to the Fjord Bypass that they brought up again. I think this is not a viable plan. The increased traffic, of course, would definitely cause grave concern for all the children and young families that live down in this area. There's school bus stops down here to provide rides to the different school locations for these children as well. We also have the entire mobile park down here, and the seniors use the greenbelt. That's their recreation. So you're talking about putting a bunch of traffic down here that would cause grave concern for your residents and compromise their safety. I don't understand why that is still even on the packet. That should be taken off. And that's been on there for a long time. It's been presented to city council many, many times to get it off there, and it still is on there. If you want to come up with a different plan, I'm all for it, but you should not be compromising the safety of your young families and your residents in our community to divert traffic through residential areas. You got to figure out a different way. So that needs to come off that whole development plan, I would say. And I can assure you, everybody down in this area feels the same way about it. It's not a safe plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Next up, Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks, Xenia.
Please go.
I guess I want to give a quick background. I am the association executive for the San Ynez Valley Association of Realtors, which means I deal with real estate on a daily basis. And I also am a member of the Gpac. And I just want to take it back for a little bit to say that I think that we have to really look at what's being done today or what's being discussed as land use alternatives. And those are, in my understanding, things that could be done. So if we make zoning more flexible, we're only saying that that allows the possibility for a developer or a property owner to come in and do something creative with the land that they own and the property that they own. That would still go through a process, as my understanding, of CAL FIRE, of EIR, of traffic study for any development that goes in. But when we look at Solvang as a whole, we have buildings like, I'll call it the water wheel building, that's falling apart right now, that is an eyesore in our town, that could very easily have been converted into retail below and residential above. When you look at the building over, it's the, I think it's called the Merck, the apartments up above the CVS, those were highly coveted. They rented very quickly and they continue to rent very quickly. I get phone calls at least once a week from people looking for rentals with budgets as high as $5,000 that cannot find property to rent and are leaving our area. And in our vision process that everyone I thought had agreed to as a whole, we talked about wanting a vibrant community that people could afford to live in. We wanted demographics of older people and younger people and people of different ethnicities. And we have RENA numbers to meet for the state. So I think that I was advocating for some measure of option B, which was a little more than we have right now, but not an outrageous change. And regardless of things like the Chumash Museum and whether that'll create traffic, that's a project that will be completed this year. We can't change that, but we can allow some more flexible zoning. At least in principle, we can say as a community, we value people that grew up here being able to afford to continue to live in this community. And we can say, okay, let's allow some flexibility in at least the zoning area, and then let the developers and the city and city planning commission work out how those details can be handled. But from a high 30,000 foot level, I think philosophically, this is a step that the city needs to take.
Thank you.
All right, next we have Nancy Emerson.
Good evening. I have a few questions and comments. I can see that it's really a challenge to do a project like this, particularly at a time when we're seeing a lot of changes in society. And one of those is remote work. And I'm wondering how we can factor that in to the employment figures, and also it probably impacts housing to some extent, and the types of mixed use that we may need in the future, with remote work being attractive to people in a valley like ours. Then I wanted to know if you have any figures on the number of persons working in Solvang who commute from elsewhere in the valley or the county. I'm thinking that they represent to some extent current unmet need for both rental and owner-occupied housing, and that we should be realizing that it's not just people who are new to the valley, but people who might want to live here if there was affordable housing and be closer to their work. And then finally, I am concerned about the impacts of state legislation that's passed recently, SB 330, SB 9 and SB 10. And I realize pushbacks going on in the state about SB 9 and 10, and we don't know how that's going to play out. But we're going to have 3 SBCAG housing allocations, the one that we've just gotten, and there are going to be 2 more. The one that we just got was 191 units in various categories, and I can't imagine that the other 2 will be any less, given the work that the state has been doing on housing. And so how can we factor in that as we look at alternatives? I agree with Elizabeth that alternative B certainly looks more like what we'd like to see in Solvang than alternative C on the surface. But these allocation figures are a big driver. And I think increasingly, they're not just letting us allocate, but they're beginning to give some pushback if we don't meet that, actually see the build out.
You are right, and Nancy, you had a lot of good points, and there's a lot to unpack there for sure. I'll start on part of this, and then I'll hand it over to Doug Svensson. You are right. There's a lot of new legislative changes that have come through. SB 9, SB 10 are some of them that have to do with single family lot splits and by right housing. SB 35 and SB 330 get into by right multifamily housing that meet a set of objective standards, which are standards that are not, they're objective, they're not subjective, so they're quantifiable, and they streamline development. A lot of those there's a lot of unknowns behind that, especially the ADU lot. Right now, every single family parcel is allowed 2 ADUs by right. And the state also modified ADU laws to allow ADUs in multifamily developments now too. So it's hard to project some of those out just because there are so many multitude of factors that will determine how all of those come into play and whether property owners want to split or add ADUs. SB 9, the legislation is so new, you're right. I think people are still testing the waters. It kicked in just this month, so it's not even a month old. So there's still a lot that even those of us who work in planning and consulting are still trying to grapple with. And we're working with city staff right now to try to highlight and elevate that discussion moving forward as part of the overall general plan. I do want to bring Doug Svensson in. I think you did have some really good questions on employment for those who travel outside for employment or travel in, and the effects of telecommuting right now and what's needed to enhance a telecommuting working environment. So Doug?
Thank you, Brent. Yes, we do expect remote work to be a thing in the future, long into the future. It does affect the demand and need for office space primarily. It's usually office workers that are most able to work remotely. So in that sense, it reinforces the way the alternatives are structured with really a minimal amount of additional office and commercial space and more focus on residential, because if people come to San Ynez Valley and Solvang and want to work from their home and have jobs down in LA or wherever it might be, you know, they're going to be looking for quality of life and good broadband infrastructure, and you know, the commercial sector from a standpoint of shopping opportunities and that sort of thing, but not, you know, really looking for office space per se. In terms of the numbers, Jim Damkowicz may have more complete data, but our information was that there are at least 250 people more commuting in than leave the city each day. And I know that, so there's a lot more than 250 that come in, because a lot of people drive out of town to go to work, but there's a net in commute of 250 is what the data we had to show. So definitely there's demand, as you say, from that sector for people that could choose to live in the city if there were housing opportunities available.
Yeah, and yeah, Doug, you're very close. So yeah, it's about 300 net importing into the city. What's interesting are just the sheer numbers. So about 2,300 commuters work in Solvang but live outside of Solvang. And so you're importing those commuters, but at the same time, about 2,000 residents of Solvang are commuting to jobs outside of Solvang. So it's almost 50-50, but yeah, there's about a net difference of 300 more that come into Solvang. Only around 550 of your residents live and work in Solvang. It's not a big number. So there is a lot of potential to keep residents and have them work in Solvang. I think telecommuting is one of those great opportunities, depending on how that plays out, that more folks who live in Solvang can actually work out of their own homes and stay within the city, all else being equal.
Thank you.
Next, we have Michelle Glaus.
Hi, mine is kind of a just a clarification of Nancy's question about the ADUs and SB9 and SB10. Are those not factored in at all on your projections over the next 20 years? Because would they not show up in the single family where you indicate when you gave the definition of single family?
Sure. I can answer that. If for those who aren't familiar with ADU law, ADUs actually don't count against density at all. So the density didn't change, and we couldn't necessarily project where ADUs are going to occur. As part of the housing element process, which is a subsequent project that's going on right now with the city of Solvang, the housing element analyzes projected ADUs as part of that process. So no, the ADUs were not factored in. They weren't taken into density because they don't count toward density per the state. So that's kind of the simple answer. We can look at past statistics and get a rough idea of what potentially could occur, but not where those units will land or not where those units will fall, because they can occur citywide. It doesn't matter on the designation if it's single family or multifamily. The state's pretty much allowing those wherever at this point. And SB9 is so new, and there's if you're familiar with SB9, there's several stipulations that come into play before a project or even your parcels eligible to take SB9 to split the lot. So a true SB9 analysis is a complete separate effort that is just beyond what this portion of the general plan is covering.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, next up we have Joanne Ricci.
Thank you. Hang on one second. I just wanted to respond to something that Nancy Emerson said. And it's really I am a proponent of mixed usage for development and high density. I think it's the only way to go given our footprint in this community. However, I live in the Mercantile building. I am grateful to have a wonderful apartment here. But one of the things that we haven't talked about is the tension between tourism and providing housing for residents in Solvang. Since I've lived in the Mercantile building, 2 of the apartments have gone into short-term rentals. Now, this really affects the ability of people who want to live in Solvang, create a life in Solvang, contribute to the well-being of Solvang, and really goes back to some of the original values that are that undergird this general plan. And I just think moving forward, we really have to talk about what kind of community do we want to be? Do we want to be a transient community that deals with short-term rentals and the effects of that in a community? Or do we want to provide grounding opportunities for folks who live and work in this community and will be here long-term? I spent a lot of years in New Orleans where the complexion of the community totally changed because of the development of multi-use and lots of apartments that were rented as a short-term rentals, and really cut out a lot of the people who lived in the community and had to go elsewhere to live. I only bring this up because I think this is really a social justice issue. And I think really needs to go back to the values that undergird the general plan moving forward. You know, I'm a capitalist. I appreciate the opportunity for people to create opportunities for generating wealth. But I also think that we need to really be very explicit when we talk about what are the upsides and downsides of the kind of development that we're thinking about in our community. Thank you.
And I appreciate those comments. I know this team that we have here tonight that's working alongside the community and city of Solvang has worked with several cities that have grappled with short-term rentals. One in particular, city of South Lake Tahoe, big on tourism, survives on tourism revenue, just like Solvang does. And sometimes the communities need to have that tough conversation about what is the stance on that. The alternative doesn't really get to that step. The general plan can have an emphasis and a focus, and that'll ultimately come down to the direction of planning commission and city council in the end. But I think that's a great comment or recommendation to bring forward that could have some policy influence down the road.
Thank you. Now we have next up is Jennifer Dryden Hess.
Hi, everyone. So for people who don't know, my background is 30 years in corporate real estate. So the Walt Disney Company and now Northern Trust. And so I have a long history in real estate and development. But the comment that I wanted to make, and I do sit on the Gpac and I also sit on the design review committee, and I'm very honored to do so, by the way. But what I wanted to say was, I think Elizabeth made a really good point about promoting the variability of the product set versus alternative B and alternative C. And then you just heard Joanne say something similar, but relative obviously to short-term versus long-term rentals, which is also a very important component. But I also wanted to point out that in B and C, you may not have caught this, but I think you should think about it. There was a height difference between B and C, and B had a 35-foot height restriction versus C was 40 plus. And I now off the top of my head, I can't remember. But I wanted everybody for me to repoint that out, because it does change the architectural view of the buildings. And so I think a lot of people have gotten really worked up about 40 plus just in some of the other projects that have been brought forward, and for good reason.
Zoom meeting for planning, city planning.
So I just wanted to be to highlight that again for everyone, so that they understood that higher density also comes with a higher height, which could impact view corridors and the way you perceive buildings. And so that was important. I thought that everyone should recognize that, because that's a big differentiator. And then the second thing was about this. It's kind of annoying the way that the report calls it a bypass, the thing on Fjord. I don't personally see it as a bypass, because I think of a bypass as like a highway. And I always thought about this, and maybe you can clarify, but I thought of it more as like a connector between a development and a road. In other words, imagine if Skit didn't have the access road to 246 from the hillside, right? And so they built that development, and then you had to go back into town. Basically, that's what we're talking about, I think, unless I misunderstood. I thought we were saying that we were going to just make the road longer, and it would still feel very residential, and it would allow that community to get out instead of blocking up on the other end into town. So that's just, for me, something that I wanted to make sure was clarified, if I misunderstood. So those were my couple of things.
Sure. No, and those are both really good, and I think we can address. We'll address the first one with the height. And I think it's important to point that out, that yes, alternative B does have a max height of 35, and that is the current height limit, maximum height limit within the city. Alternative C takes it up by 10 feet and goes up to 45 feet maximum height. And you are right that when you increase residential development, you increase square footage on property. That increased space needs to go somewhere. And in that case, that space to accommodate it in alternative C was just was shown to go up by 10 extra feet, up to 45 feet. And Jordan Cowell on our team can explain the rationale of where that 45 comes from, that might provide a little bit more insight and why we came to that specific number. Jordan, do you want to explain the height of current development for residential and non-residential uses?
Thanks, Brent. So Jennifer, good to see you again. You probably heard this spiel at our last Gpac meeting. So prior to Mintier Harnish, I have background working with builders and developers at an architecture firm. So some of the current trends in development are going with higher plate heights. So what that means is higher floor to ceiling heights. So pretty much the 7-foot and now 8-foot ceilings are kind of going out the door. You're looking at more like 9-foot, 10-foot ceilings. So we kind of wanted to provide a higher height option in alternative C. So that would kind of appeal to more of the current trends. And so when you look at kind of the numbers aspect and look at the existing fabric of Solvang, you're looking at steep pitched roofs. And then when you get down into the construction of that, doing 45 feet allows you to go an additional floor. 35 feet, it's really hard to do 3 stories. It kind of blocks you down into the 2 stories. if you want to maintain what current development trends are with the higher ceiling heights. So I don't know if that kind of answers your.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I don't think people understand that. So while I do, I just want to make sure the community understands.
And I really appreciate, I appreciate you bringing that to everybody's attention, because I know we really didn't get into the heights in this presentation, so.
And then if Jim Damquich, if you could touch on the Fjord extension and that sometimes there's a confusion between what we all think of a bypass, quote unquote, and what that actual extension is.
Right, yeah, and it is called the Fjord Extension. I think in my presentation, I said it's not a true bypass, if that's what folks were thinking it was going to be. And so this kind of ties into the earlier statements that were made about the concerns that, hey, if we do this, it's going to pull a lot of through traffic off of 246 and just dump it into our neighborhoods. That's not going to happen with the Fjord extension. This is basically providing additional access for local traffic. So this will provide a more direct way for folks who live in those neighborhoods who happen to be traveling east on Mission or 246 and can now, if it is there, they can access their neighborhoods in a much more efficient way without having to traverse further along 246 Mission Boulevard and then work their way down on local streets where there's a lot of pedestrians and so on and so forth. So the idea is that the Fjord extension will actually be a new access for folks to access their homes and schools and so on and so forth. So that's the idea. So I appreciate you making that distinction. It is not a bypass, it's an extension.
Thanks, Jim. I just wanted to make sure I didn't misunderstand because I thought, yeah, so thank you.
Okay, next up we have Susan Deloney. That's the last comment we have. So if anybody else would like to speak, please raise your hands. Susan, go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about affordable housing in a couple of different ways. And right now I have family members looking for housing in East Bay, San Francisco area. And the pressures up there are very interesting. It's completely unprecedented and it could happen here. But just to let you know, folks in Silicon Valley are buying second homes in the suburbs or just moving out altogether to the suburbs. Lots that are built have ADUs built on them already. They're ahead of us up there, have put that those properties out of the reach of young families. Multi-generational families are there too. And the prices have gone up, 25% in just, a matter of a month. So people are sort of panic buying. And that is a result, I guess, of the pandemic and remote working. The other thing was the definition of affordable housing. I kind of see in two different ways. One is subsidized affordable housing, which I've been told years ago is really the only way that you can actually make it affordable. And then it makes perfect sense to me because some people's salaries just cannot afford to pay the rent. The other way is affordable by design. I learned that term recently, and it's kind of what Ed St. George was suggesting with micro units. They're so small that they're going to be affordable. The other thing that I was thinking about, and I wonder why has no other mobile home park been built in Solvang? They have so many advantages. They're single story, they don't have common walls, they're really great for people that don't want stairs. That's just what I'm wondering. Seems like a great affordable by design. It's always been affordable, relatively speaking. It's market rate, of course. And do you have any answers about that?
Well, in regards to mobile homes, I don't. It's a good question. I think if I was to attempt it, it's partly due to the price of land. And you're just not getting the, I apologize for the barking in the background. Gotta love pets on Zoom. You're not getting your you're not getting the amount of sale per unit back as much as you would if you packed in more units at a higher density, where mobile home parks are typically of a lower density. So they just don't pencil as much. The developers aren't making as much, especially when the land values are so high. And that's what you're seeing in the Bay Area that you had mentioned, that the land values are so high. You need more units that would sell for more or rent for more in order to make a profit. And you're just not seeing that right now. I think mobile home parks were more prevalent when land values were lower. And there's benefits to living in mobile home parks. I lived in one at one point, so I definitely see the benefit. The state does have certain protections on mobile home park conversions, realizing that is one source of affordable housing. So that I think that's something that we can applaud the state of California for focusing on.
Right, yeah. Well, I suppose then maybe it would be taking ag land, which would be annexing land because it's cheaper.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, would anybody else like to make any comments? If so, please raise your hand. Otherwise, that was our last comment. And I'll turn it over to Brent and the team to see if you have any closing comments.
Okay. Well, I just appreciate everybody for sticking through with us. I know this was long. This was actually our full 2 hours. We went 6 minutes over. A lot of great questions tonight. And all of these questions, just so you're aware, we're recording all of them. We will have responses to those. Those will be included in a summary that will go up onto the Plan Solvang website early next month. Before a council meeting, we're scheduled to go to council early to mid-February to bring all of the feedback that we've received from this report. So any comments that are submitted on the Plan Solvang website, the survey that Jordan talked about, please go and take the survey. There's even more questions and the ability to provide more input. And really, it's getting down to the preference of what are the mobility options that best serve the community that the council should consider moving forward over the next 20 years. What is what type of growth do you foresee or don't foresee in Solvang moving forward? That's what we need to know. It's a community-driven plan. It's not a consultant team plan. And this plan is built off of what the community says and brings forward. It goes through the Gpac. The Gpac reviews it and it moves its way up all the way through your decision makers. So please go take the survey, review the boards. This video will be live in a few days. And I would say keep an eye out for the summary on all of the community outreach we have so far. And then just look forward towards the next steps when we start to narrow it down to what's known as a preferred alternative that'll be incorporated into the general plan. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate you taking the time tonight.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Once again, echo everybody, please take the survey, reach out to anybody else in the community and spread the word. And we will see you for both live and in-person participation at the next opportunity to make comments at the council meeting on February 14th, Love Solving. And after that, you'll have continuous opportunities for the Planning Commission and City Council, and the Gpac, of course, will be involved as well. So thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.